and the story Ginger herself has consistently told. Ginger largely kept herself to herself.
For nearly 50 years, the Presley family kept quiet about Ginger Alden. Not the polished, publicist-approved kind of quiet, the other kind, the kind that comes from grief that never fully healed, from questions that were never answered cleanly, from a loss so sudden and so enormous that everyone around it was left holding pieces of a story that didn't quite fit together. And in that silence, a narrative took shape, not necessarily a fair one, but a persistent one. Ginger Alden, the 21-year-old woman Elvis Presley had placed an engagement ring on just months before his death, became, in many circles, a figure of suspicion, someone on the outside of the family looking in, someone who was there at the end but never fully welcomed into the fold. Someone who, depending on who you asked, was either deeply loved by Elvis or deeply misunderstood by everyone else. For decades, the Presley inner circle said very little about her publicly, and that silence, it spoke volumes. Until now. Because a woman named Donna Presley, Elvis's cousin, a woman who grew up inside that family, who sat at those dinner tables, who watched Elvis live and watched his world collapse when he died, just broke that silence. And what she said is not what you would expect from someone on the inside of that family. It is not defensive. It is not protective of an old grudge. It is something far more rare and far more powerful than that. It is an admission. And it changes the way you have to look at everything that followed August 16, 1977. To understand why Donna's words land as hard as they do, you first have to understand who she is within this story. Donna Presley is not a peripheral figure. She's not a distant relative who occasionally crossed paths with Elvis at Christmas. She's part of the bloodline, part of the inner world that surrounded Elvis Presley in a way that very few people on this earth ever were. She knew the man, not the icon, not the mythology, the man, the cousin. The family member who existed before the fame metastasized into something too large for any human being to carry comfortably. That proximity matters enormously, because when Donna Presley says something about Elvis or about someone in Elvis's life, she is not operating from tabloid reporting or secondhand accounts or the kind of surface-level familiarity that most people who have ever written or spoken about Elvis are working from. She was there. Her perspective is firsthand. Her silence for all these years was a choice, and now so is speaking. So when she opens up about Ginger Alden, a woman the Presley family quietly kept at a distance for going on 5 decades, you have to ask yourself a question that most people have never stopped to seriously consider. What did the family actually think of Ginger, and what did they get wrong? Here is what the historical record looks like if you strip away the emotion and just look at the facts. Elvis Presley met Ginger Alden in November of 1976. He was 41 years old, he was exhausted, he was carrying the full impossible weight of being Elvis Presley, and he was, by most accounts from people who knew him well, still searching. Still reaching for something steady, something real. Within weeks of meeting Ginger, he was deeply attached to her. By January of 1977, he had proposed. He placed a ring on her finger. He made a choice, a very deliberate, very public within his world choice, that this was the woman he wanted beside him. 7 months later, Ginger Alden found Elvis Presley's body on the bathroom floor of Graceland. She was 21 years old. Let that sit for a moment. 21 years old, engaged to the most famous human being on the planet. And then in one morning, all of it, the future, the plans, the ring on her finger, the life she had been promised, gone. Replaced by something no person, least of all a 21-year-old woman, should ever have to carry. And what happened next? The Presley family closed ranks, which is understandable. Grief does that, loss does that. Families in shock reach for the people they already know and trust, and they form a circle, and everything outside that circle becomes, at least temporarily, something foreign, something that doesn't quite belong. Ginger was outside that circle. She had not had years to build relationships within the family. She and Donna Presley, by Donna's own admission, never really came to know each other. The intimacy and familiarity that might have bridged that gap simply had not been given the time to develop. And when Elvis died, that gap became a wall. Not necessarily a wall built from malice, but a wall built from grief, confusion, shock, and the very human tendency to question everything and everyone in the immediate aftermath of an unthinkable loss. Within that atmosphere of grief and suspicion, questions began to form about Ginger. Why had she been asleep? Why hadn't she checked on him sooner? Was she really who Elvis believed her to be? Did she love him the way he loved her? And underneath all of those questions, unspoken but very much present, was the most unfair question of all, the one that grief sometimes generates even when it has no business being asked. Was she somehow responsible for this? None of those questions were fair, but grief is not fair. and the Presley family, by Donna's own account, was navigating shock and heartbreak on a scale that most families will never encounter. Elvis was not just a son, a cousin, a family member. He was the center of an entire universe, the economic, emotional, and spiritual gravity of an entire extended world of people. And when that center collapsed, everything around it destabilized simultaneously. Ginger Alden got caught in that destabilization. She was judged quietly in ways she may never have fully known. She was held at arm's length. She was, in the eyes of some, a question mark where there should have been a chapter. And so she did what any young woman in an impossible position might do. She stepped back, she stayed quiet, she did not fight for a seat at the table she had never quite been invited to. She simply withdrew, she protected herself. She carried what she knew privately for years before she ever began to speak publicly about Elvis and about her experience. And that restraint, that choice to stay quiet rather than strike back, was in many circles read as coldness, as guilt, as something suspicious in and of itself. She couldn't win, speak and be called opportunistic, stay silent and be called cold. That is the particular kind of impossible that surrounds women who exist at the edges of powerful men's stories. And then decades passed. And Donna Presley, who had lived inside all of this, who had watched it unfold, who had held her own complicated feelings about Ginger Alden for all of those years, sat down and did something unexpected. She reflected, honestly, without the armor of grief, without the defensiveness of family loyalty distorting her vision. She looked back at what she knew, what she had seen, what Ginger had said over the years, and she arrived somewhere she clearly did not expect to arrive. She arrived at respect. Not the performative kind, not the kind you offer because it's politically convenient or because public opinion has shifted. The quiet, hard-won kind that only comes from genuinely rethinking something you believed for a very long time. And what Donna said, what she finally put into words after nearly 50 years, is not just about Ginger Alden. It is about the way this family, this world, and this culture treated a young woman who happened to be standing closest to Elvis Presley at the moment everything ended. It is about what it costs to tell the truth quietly in a world that rewards noise. And it is about one specific thing that Donna Presley identified in Ginger that she found almost nowhere else in the vast, crowded landscape of people who have made their living from Elvis's name and Elvis's memory. Dignity. But here's where everything gets complicated, because what Donna said next quietly dismantles a story that has been told about Ginger Alden for nearly 50 years. And more than that, it dismantles a story that has been told about Elvis himself. The Elvis the media built, the Elvis that tragedy turned into a product, the Elvis that, it turns out, may have looked almost nothing like the man that the two people closest to his final chapter actually knew. And neither of them has ever stopped saying so. There is a particular kind of injustice that history rarely bothers to correct. It is not the loud injustice, the kind that generates protests and headlines and impassioned op-eds. It is quieter than that. It is the injustice of a narrative that hardens before anyone stops to question it, where a version of someone gets repeated so many times, across so many years, through so many different mouths that it stops feeling like an interpretation and starts feeling like a fact. That is what happened to Ginger Alden. Not overnight, not with one single moment of cruelty or one defining accusation. It happened gradually in the way that reputations are quietly shaped by absence, by who controls the story when someone chooses not to fight over it. And Ginger Alden, for a very long time, chose not to fight. She chose something rarer and, in the world she was navigating, far more dangerous. She chose silence. And the world punished her for it. To understand what Ginger was actually walking into when she met Elvis Presley in 1976, you have to understand the ecosystem that surrounded him. Because Elvis did not exist in the world the way ordinary people exist. He was not simply a famous man with a large house and a recognizable face. He was an institution, a mythology, a gravitational force that bent the lives of every single person who came close enough to feel it. Around that force existed an entire infrastructure of people whose identities, livelihoods, and sense of self were inseparable from their proximity to Elvis. The Memphis Mafia, the handlers, the yes-men and the loyal friends and the family members and the business associates whose entire world was organized around one man at the center. That world had its own rules, its own language, its own hierarchy. And it had very little patience for anyone new trying to enter it, particularly a young woman who had captured Elvis's attention in the way that Ginger had. She walked into a world that was already complete, already closed, already deeply suspicious of outsiders, and she was 20 years old. Not 21, she was 20 years old when they met. By the time Elvis died, she had just turned 21. She was, by almost any measure, still a girl who happened to be engaged to the most scrutinized human being on the planet, surrounded by people who had known Elvis for decades and had no particular reason to welcome her, living inside a world so far removed from anything resembling ordinary experience that even the most grounded person would have struggled to find solid footing. And nobody gave her a map, nobody walked her through it. Nobody sat her down and said, here is how this works, here is who you can trust, here is how to survive being loved by someone this large. And then August 16th happened, and everything changed, and the world wanted a response from her that she was never equipped to give. Here is what almost never gets discussed when people talk about Ginger Alden and the aftermath of Elvis's death. The culture of 1977 had a very specific and very narrow set of expectations for women in her position. Grief, if you were a woman attached to a powerful man, was supposed to be performed in one of exactly two ways. You either disappeared, quietly, gracefully, permanently. You retreated from public life, you said nothing, you let the family and the machine control the narrative, and you accepted whatever version of events they chose to circulate. You became a footnote, a detail, someone mentioned briefly and then set aside. Or you performed, you appeared in front of cameras with red eyes and a composed expression, and you said the right things in the right order, and you gave the public the grief spectacle they were hungry for. You became the mourning fiancée, the tragic young woman left behind, the human face of an incomprehensible loss. You fed the machine. Ginger Alden did neither. She did not disappear and she did not perform. She stepped back, yes. She stayed quiet for long stretches, yes, but she did not vanish, and when she eventually did speak, when she began years later to share her memories and her perspective, she did not do it in the way the machine expected. She did not arrive with a tell-all designed to shock. She did not come armed with scandals or betrayals or carefully packaged revelations. She simply told her story, consistently, humanly, without venom. And because that did not fit either of the two acceptable templates, it was treated with suspicion. Now contrast that with what others in Elvis's orbit actually did in the years that followed his death. Members of the Memphis Mafia published books, several of them, books that painted Elvis in ways that ranged from deeply unflattering to outright damaging, books that exposed private details, private struggles, private moments that Elvis himself would almost certainly never have consented to having published, books that made their authors comfortable livings off the dismantling of a man they had called a friend. Former employees sold stories, former acquaintances gave interviews. People who had spent a handful of hours in the same room as Elvis positioned themselves as intimate insiders and monetized every second of that proximity. The market for Elvis content, particularly dark Elvis content, struggling Elvis content, tragic Elvis content, was enormous. And it was fed consistently and enthusiastically by people who had stood far closer to the exit than Ginger Alden ever did. She watched all of that happen, and she stayed quiet. Not because she had nothing to say, she had everything to say. She had been there, she had known him, she had found him. She carried memories and conversations and moments that nobody else on earth had access to. She was sitting on more raw material than almost anyone else in that entire world, and she chose, again and again, not to weaponize it. Do you understand how unusual that is? In an industry built on the buying and selling of celebrity intimacy, Ginger Alden was holding a goldmine and refusing to mine it. Not for decades, not because she had been legally prevented from doing so, but because she apparently believed that some things were not for sale. That is not coldness, that is not calculation, that is not the behavior of someone who was only ever in it for what she could get. That is integrity, the quiet, unglamorous, largely unrewarded kind. But integrity, as it turns out, is a difficult thing to market. And in the absence of Ginger telling her story loudly, other people told it for her. They filled the silence she left with their own interpretations, their own suspicions, their own convenient narratives about who she must have been and what her motivations must have been, and why exactly a 21-year-old woman might have chosen to stay close to Elvis Presley in the final months of his life. None of those interpretations were particularly kind, most of them were not particularly fair, and almost none of them came from people who actually knew her. They came from a public and a media ecosystem that had decided, in the absence of her voice, to write her character themselves. And the character they wrote was not a grieving fiancé. It was not a young woman in an impossible situation trying to hold herself together. It was something more convenient and more damning than that. It was suspicion with a face. And that version of Ginger Alden calcified. It got repeated. It became, for many people, simply the accepted understanding of who she was and what she represented in the Elvis story. Until a woman who actually knew Elvis, who shared his bloodline, who sat inside that family, who had held her own complicated feelings about Ginger for decades, sat down and said something that cut straight through 50 years of calcified assumption. She said, "I got her wrong, we got her wrong." And then she said something even more important than that, something about Elvis himself, about who he actually was in those final months, about the version of him that Ginger had been quietly, consistently, stubbornly describing for years, while almost everyone else was selling a different story entirely. And when you hear what Donna Presley said about that, about the Elvis both she and Ginger actually knew, everything you thought you understood about this story shifts. Because there is a version of Elvis that became, over the decades, almost impossible to argue with, not because it was necessarily accurate, but because it was repeated so many times, packaged so many ways, and proven so commercially reliable that it eventually crowded out almost every other version that existed. You know this Elvis, you have seen him, the bloated tragedy, the man undone by fame and excess and the crushing impossibility of his own mythology, the cautionary tale that filled documentaries and books and retrospectives and anniversary specials, the Elvis who, by the final chapter of his life, was presented as a man already halfway gone, already defeated, already a ghost haunting the walls of Graceland while the clock quietly ran out. That version of Elvis sells, it is always sold. Tragedy is a product that never goes out of fashion, and Elvis Presley's particular tragedy, so large, so public, so wrapped in the very American seduction of a dream that consumed its dreamer, has been one of the most profitable products the entertainment industry has ever had the luxury of recycling. And here is the darkest part of that truth. The people closest to Elvis, the ones with genuine first-hand access to who he actually was in those final months, had a choice to make. They could tell the complicated, human, sometimes hopeful and sometimes painful truth about what they actually witnessed, or they could give the market what it wanted. They could feed the tragedy, they could confirm the mythology. They could make themselves indispensable to a narrative that was already written and already proven to generate attention, book deals, and documentary credits. Most of them chose the market. But two people didn't. Two people separated by their relationship to Elvis, separated by family tension and decades of complicated distance, looked back at the same man and described someone almost entirely different from the figure that history decided to sell. Donna Presley, his cousin, said she saw happiness. She saw humor. She saw a man who was tender and generous and genuinely excited about the future. She did not see someone stumbling toward an ending. She saw someone who was still, in spite of everything, reaching forward, planning, laughing, caring for the people around him with a generosity that she described as almost beyond measure. She saw a man who, yes, carried enormous pressure that would have broken almost anyone, but who had not been broken, not in the way the world later decided he had been. And Ginger Alden, Ginger had been saying the exact same thing for years. She spoke of an Elvis who was hopeful, who talked about the future with genuine enthusiasm, who made plans, real plans, not the desperate grasping of someone trying to outrun a darkness closing in, but the natural forward-thinking of a man who still believed there was something worth building toward. She described someone who found joy in small moments, who laughed easily, who was engaged with the people around him, present in conversations, alive to the life still moving through him. That is not the Elvis the world was sold. But it is the Elvis that both of these women, one who shared his blood, one who wore his ring, consistently and independently described, without coordinating their stories, without any particular incentive to align their accounts, just two people telling what they actually saw. Now ask yourself the question that almost nobody in the media has ever stopped to ask seriously. Who benefits from the broken Elvis story? Think about it carefully. Every book written about a hopeless, tragic, defeated Elvis. Every documentary that lingers on the worst moments, the worst images, the steepest decline. Every retrospective that frames his death as the inevitable conclusion of a life that had already collapsed. Who profits from that? Who needs that version to be true? Who has built careers, reputations, and revenue streams on the foundation of that particular narrative? The people who told it, the ones who packaged and sold it. The ones who positioned themselves as brave truth-tellers willing to expose the darkness behind the curtain while conveniently making themselves central to the story in the process. Now ask who benefits from the hopeful Elvis, the human Elvis, the man who was still laughing in the weeks before he died, still making plans, still reaching for tomorrow. Nobody profits from that story. There is no market for it. It does not generate the same hunger or the same revenue or the same cultural momentum. It is simply the truth, or as close to the truth as two people with genuine first-hand access have ever consistently offered. And almost nobody listened. There is something deeply significant about the convergence of Donna Presley's account and Ginger Alden's, not because either of them is infallible, not because memory is perfect or grief doesn't distort, but because they arrived at the same portrait of the same man from two completely different directions, and they did it without any apparent effort to coordinate, collaborate, or confirm each other's version. That kind of independent corroboration is rare. In a story as mythologized and commercially distorted as Elvis Presley's, it is almost unprecedented. And what it suggests is uncomfortable for a lot of people. It suggests that the version of Elvis that has been most loudly and most persistently promoted, the broken man, the cautionary tale, the tragedy product, may have been built less on what was true and more on what was profitable. It suggests that two women who were pushed to the margins of this story, who were given no particular platform and no particular reward for the accounts they offered, may have been telling a more honest version of events than the people who were given every platform and every reward. When the woman who found his body and the woman who grew up inside his family both sit down, independently across decades of silence, and describe the same man, a man who was still hopeful, still planning, still alive in every way that mattered, maybe the question isn't whether to believe them. Maybe the question is why it took this long for anyone to seriously try. There is a cost to staying quiet for 50 years. People rarely talk about that cost. They talk about the cost of speaking, the backlash, the scrutiny, the way the world picks apart anyone who dares to step forward with a version of events that challenges what has already been decided. That cost is real and it is visible and it gets discussed at length. But the cost of silence, that one is quieter, it accumulates in private. It sits with you at the dinner table and in the early hours of the morning when memory comes without invitation, and you find yourself holding things that were never meant to be held alone for this long. Donna Presley held her complicated feelings about Ginger Alden for nearly 5 decades. She held the grief of losing Elvis. She held the confusion of those immediate aftermath days when questions were flying and nobody had answers, and the family was closing in on itself trying to make sense of something that could not be made sense of. She held the distance that had grown, naturally and perhaps inevitably, between herself and the young woman who had been closest to Elvis at the end. She held all of it without resolution, without the conversation that might have provided it. And then she did something that takes more courage than most people recognize. She changed her mind, publicly, about someone she had kept at arm's length for most of her adult life. That is not a small thing. That is not the kind of thing people do easily or casually, or for any reason other than genuine reckoning with the truth. Donna admitted something in her statement that deserves far more attention than it has received. She said she reached out to Ginger, not once, more than once. She extended an olive branch, quietly, privately, without making a public performance of the gesture, and she never received a response. Now think about how that detail could be framed by someone with less integrity than Donna appears to have. Think about how easily that unanswered outreach could have been weaponized. Think about how effortlessly it could have been used to paint Ginger as cold, dismissive, uninterested in healing or connection or resolution. Think about how many people in Donna's position would have led with that detail rather than buried it inside a statement of genuine admiration. Donna didn't do that. She mentioned it not as an accusation but as an honest admission of incompleteness, of a conversation she still hopes to have someday, of a connection she still believes is worth pursuing, not for the public, not for the story, but simply because two people who knew Elvis in deeply personal ways might have something meaningful to offer each other. That is grace, quiet, uncelebrated, 50 years in the making grace. And it tells you something important about what this statement actually is. It is not a media play. It is not a strategic repositioning designed to ride a wave of public sympathy toward Ginger Alden. It is not timed to a book release or a documentary premiere or an anniversary that needed a headline. It is simply a woman who spent decades sitting with something and eventually arrived at the place where honesty became more important than loyalty to an old and perhaps never fully justified position. But zoom out for a moment, because this story is not only about Donna and Ginger and the complicated geography of grief inside the Presley family. It is about something much larger than that. It is about what happens to the people who orbit legends, what it costs them, what it takes from them, what it turns them into, sometimes against their own will, sometimes without their full awareness, sometimes in ways they only begin to understand decades after the fact. Elvis Presley's death did not just end one life, it detonated inside the lives of everyone around him. And the fallout from that detonation did not settle cleanly or quickly. It kept moving. It kept reshaping relationships and loyalties and identities and memories for years, for decades, and in some cases for the rest of the lives of the people caught inside it. Donna Presley grew up in that fallout. She carried it. She navigated a grief that was simultaneously private and profoundly public, personal and yet constantly claimed by strangers who had never met Elvis but felt entitled to define him anyway. She watched people she knew participate in the mythology machine. She watched the story get bent and stretched and commercialized in ways that must have felt, on some level, like a second loss. And through all of that, she held her silence about Ginger Alden, until now. What does it mean that she chose now to speak? It means that at some point, the truth became more important than the comfort of staying quiet. It means that something in Donna's honest reflection of those years brought her to a place where withholding this particular acknowledgement felt like its own kind of injustice. It means that 50 years is apparently how long it sometimes takes for grief to clear enough that you can finally see the person standing on the other side of it without the distortion that loss creates. And what she saw when that distortion finally cleared was a woman who had done something almost nobody else in Elvis's world managed to do. Ginger Alden walked away from the most commercially valuable story of her generation and chose to protect the man inside it rather than profit from the mythology around him. She did not tear him down. She did not expose him. She did not reshape her account every few years to stay relevant or to capture a new audience or to align herself with whatever version of Elvis was trending in the cultural conversation at that particular moment. She told the same story, quietly, consistently, for 50 years. And in a world where consistency is rare and honesty is rarely rewarded and dignity is almost never the most profitable option available, that matters enormously. Donna Presley said something near the end of her statement that should probably be the last word on this. She said that in a world where so many had benefited from diminishing Elvis Presley, Ginger Alden chose restraint instead of destruction, dignity instead of spectacle, consistency instead of reinvention. That is not a small eulogy for someone's character. That is one of the most meaningful things one human being can say about another, especially when it comes from someone who spent decades on the other side of an invisible wall, holding a complicated feeling that turned out, on closer inspection, to have been wrong. In 50 years of people talking about Elvis Presley, almost nobody has said what Donna Presley just said. Maybe because it required something that the mythology machine never rewards. It required looking back honestly. It required sitting with discomfort long enough to let it become clarity. It required the willingness to say, plainly and without performance, 3 of the hardest words available to any human being. I was wrong. She got that right, and it only took 50 years. If this story made you see Ginger Alden differently, or made you question the version of Elvis that history decided to sell you, say something in the comments, because the loudest stories are not always the truest ones, and the people history got wrong deserve someone willing to say so. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. We are just getting started.